Okay, so we're going to look at our next video, which is the existence of God and its arguments based on reason. Once this video is complete, the next video will actually be on religious experience, followed by the problem of evil, and that will conclude the set of revision videos on philosophy of religion. Okay, so in our previous video, we've previously looked at the existence of God based on a posteriori arguments. This second video is going to look at a priori arguments, or as Kant called them, ontological arguments. Again, it goes without saying that if you're not familiar with those terms, you really need to be in preparation for the exam. Okay, so the first argument we'll look at is St. Anselm's ontological argument. Unlike Aquinas, who seeks God through the senses, Anselm feels that this is not sufficient, and he attempts to understand God's existence through an a priori methodology. His argument is based on contradiction. Now remember that both Anselm and Aquinas are writing at a time when religious thought is very much in the ascendancy, and so there is no one, well, obviously there are some people, but no one who tends to reject the idea of God. So none of these arguments are rejections of God, they're just attempts to kind of define God and find proof of God's existence, and they go through it through different methodologies. Now the key quote here for St. Anselm, if you're going to use a quote, which hopefully you will do, is God is something than which nothing greater can be thought. Now Anselm argues his ontological argument using two different examples. The first of these arguments is based on someone who is a fool. Remember, he's not going to say that there is someone who genuinely believes that God doesn't exist. He's going to suggest that there are foolish people who might believe that's the case. As I say, Anselm uses two different arguments, and this is the first of these. So the first one is the fool who knows the definition of God, but doesn't actually believe in God's existence. Anselm considers this is a contradiction. Now, he goes back to an earlier empiricist, Aristotle, who denies that contradictions can exist. And so Anselm concludes that God must exist. Only a fool knows how to define God, but then doesn't believe that God exists. Why would you be able to define something but then not believe in its existence? It just doesn't seem to make sense according to Anselm, and is a contradiction. The second point that Anselm makes is to use the analogy of a painter to illustrate the point that things exist in understanding and those that are understood to exist. Now, as I say, he uses the example of a painter. He says that a painter thinks of a picture, but doesn't yet understand that that actually exists until he's committed paint to paper and has the final picture. One kind of is understood in his mind and exists in his mind, but it's only when it's actually produced that it understands to exist. And obviously something that exists is clearly more real than something that's simply understood in our mind. To Anselm, God exists in our mind, and therefore God exists in reality. Anselm then goes on to talk of God as a necessary being. He doesn't think that God is a contingent being such as human beings. Now we can think of this using four categories that another philosopher, and a philosopher that we will come across later on, Boethius, says that things fall into. And these categories are things that are possible to be, human beings; things that are possible not to be, again, human beings. We can either exist or not exist. Things that are not possible to be, for example, illogical things such as circular squares; and things that are not possible not to be. In other words, necessary beings, of which God is a necessary being, and perhaps the only necessary being. Now, this isn't to say that St Anselm is without criticism. Contemporaries of Anselm criticise Anselm's arguments. Again, don't think that they are criticising him from a religious point of view. They're not. They're just criticising him from a logical point of view. So they're not criticising his notion that God exists. No one's going to be brave enough to stick their head above the parapet and say, I don't think God exists. So Gaunilo is a contemporary of Anselm. He questions the idea of perfection. Obviously, Anselm is arguing that God is a perfect being. And Gaunilo says, think of a perfect island. Now, that perfect island couldn't be perfect if it didn't exist. However, we know that perfect things don't exist. We can't point to perfect chairs, perfect tables, etc. And as a consequence of that, we can't really point to the perfect island. As a consequence of that, we can't think of a perfect human being or a perfect being such as God. This seems to be a logically inconsistent argument. Anselm's response to this is that the island is contingent on other things such as the sea and the earth. So in order to think of a perfect island, you need to think perhaps of a perfect sea, a perfect earth, etc. He agrees that those things can't be perfect, but his argument is that God is contingent on nothing and that his argument only applies to God. So that's one way of answering Gaunilo's criticism. Anselm's argument is then later adopted by philosophers as we go through time. And you remember that there's this separation between empiricists who are basing their philosophy on sense experience and rationalists who are basing their philosophy on the application of the mind to philosophical problems. One of these rationalists is Descartes. According to Descartes, God is a perfect being. And again, we'll look at Descartes in more detail when we come to the meditations. Not only is God a perfect being, God is also a defining predicate. In other words, God's properties define God. So again, when we look at notions of what God is, you'll see that there are, some characteristics which people generally agree that God has: all-powerful, all-knowing, all-loving, etc. So in other words, according to Descartes, God defines himself in terms of the properties that he actually has. However, as with Anselm, Descartes' philosophy is not without criticism. In this case, Kant offers a critique of Descartes. The first criticism is that God might be a defining predicate. So what? In other words, you might just want to reject that God actually exists. The second is that existence is not a predicate at all. Kant basically says that this is not a solid enough argument. Just because X exists, or you say that X exists, it doesn't really tell you very much about the thing that you're talking about in the first instance. So there's an element of criticism from Kant with regard to Anselm. So in conclusion, in thinking about God, it may well seem that a priori arguments are more persuasive than those based on a posteriori evidence. We might find that there's very little evidential evidence. That's a clumsy way of saying it, but there's very little evidence of God's existence, whereas God's existence based on the notion that we have things in our mind such as perfection, the notion of infinity, etc. Those things that are in our mind seem to indicate the presence of a higher being. However, it should be said that a priori arguments aren't without criticism. Principally, can we define God in the same way as we define triangles? We might find that, quite a clumsy thing to do. So there's plenty of stuff that you need to read up about. And as I say, our next revision topic will look at religious experience and whether people can say that they have had a religious experience of God, and does that offer sufficient evidence of God's existence.